How's it going, guys? I'm the Stock Retro Gamer, and welcome to another Which Did It First. This episode is going to be a bit different, as I won't be focusing on a game genre, but more the tech side of gaming. I've seen how these little machines have made a massive comeback in recent years, and rightly so. I'm going to talk about handheld games consoles. Handheld consoles were a game changer when released, made popular with such devices as the Nintendo Game Boy and Sega Game Gear in the early 90s. They enabled the casual gamer to be able to game whilst on the move, be it train, plane, or dentist waiting room. These devices could be played anywhere, no longer limiting the playing of video games to the home. As time went on, they've become more ergonomic, more powerful, and just damn impressive. I want to know which handhelds were pioneering in their designs and capabilities, and shaped the way we game on the move. So join me, the Stock Retro Gamer, as I talk about handheld consoles and which did it first. Released in 1979 and developed by Milton Bradley, the Microvision was the first handheld console to ever hit the market. It was a rectangular plastic device, shaped a bit like a TV remote, had an LCD 16x16 pixel panel, some buttons on the front, and a rotating knob for game controls. It was designed by Jay Smith, the engineer who would later design the Vectrex video game console. For its games, it featured interchangeable ROM cartridges that could be swapped in and out. Instead of a small tucked away slot in the back, the cartridges would fit on top of the device. This process was still in its infancy at the time, as only a few games consoles were doing this, like the Atari 2600 and the Fairchild Channel F. The handheld itself didn't actually contain a CPU, and instead each game cartridge came with its own CPU, which was a fairly innovative design. Only 12 games were made for the Microvision, which as you can imagine were very basic in their design. These included Blockbuster, Connect 4, and the licensed Star Trek game Phaser Strike. The Microvision's lifespan was very short, only lasting 2 years, being discontinued in 1981, but pioneered the concept of gaming on the go. The D-pad, a more elegant input device for a more civilised time. Before the D-pad, the joystick was king. Then along came this plastic flat surface mechanism, and we were like, how in the hell did we play games without this? The D-pad has been relegated to second best now, as the joystick's younger, more petite cousin, the analog stick, has taken the throne. Released in 1984 and developed by Epoch. The Epoch Game Pocket Computer is a second generation handheld console, released exclusively in Japan. It featured a monochrome screen, which was 76x64 pixels, and had a horizontal form factor. The first handheld console to have this form factor, may I add. It also featured a directional pad, or D-pad for movement, and was the first handheld console to do this. No longer would players struggle over clunky mechanisms to move their sprites. The D-pad was simple, functional, and practical. So much so that pretty much every handheld console and full-size console used it for the next 15 years for their controls. Now let's give credit where it's due. The Epoch may have been the first handheld console to feature a D-pad, but it wasn't the first, since the Nintendo Donkey Kong Game & Watch featured one before this. This was designed by Gunpei Yokoi, but more on Mr. Yokoi later. The Epoch only had 7 games designed for it, 2 of which were built into the system itself. I'd love to say the innovation of the D-pad with this device was enough to make it a success, but with its lack of games, the Epoch was a commercial failure in Japan, perhaps slightly ahead of its time. Early handheld displays will be black and white, or use dot matrix, offering a very bare bones picture. Anything colourful or fancy would drain the battery power too quick, which would then defeat the point of the handheld system. Eventually systems became more advanced and could display colour with optimum power usage. Released in 1989 and developed by Atari, the Atari Lynx is a 4th gen horizontal handheld games console, originally released in North America and then Europe and Japan. It was the first handheld developed by video game giants Atari in their attempt to keep up with the Nintendo and Sega takeover. The system featured a colour LCD screen, offering colour gaming on a handheld for the first time. As you can see, the colour screen was quite something, offering a sharp image with crystal clarity. Atari released a slightly smaller version of the Lynx called the Lynx 2 in 1991. It had a slicker look, better hardware, and an increased battery life. The only real contender with the Lynx was Nintendo's Game Boy, which was a monochromatic system, but its simple design and large choice of quality games really gave the Lynx much more than a run for its money. The Atari Lynx had a fairly decent lifespan, being discontinued in 1995, however only had 73 games made for it. Atari wouldn't throw their hat in the handheld ring again. They released the Atari Jaguar in 1993, which was a commercial failure, and by 1996 had ceased development on any hardware or software. Being able to connect your gaming device to the internet these days seems like a given. The very idea of not having Wi-Fi connection in whatever current games console you're playing is unheard of. We need to be able to play other people across the globe, have our high scores celebrated with strangers, and have the latest software update downloaded. But this wasn't always the case. Released in 1997 and developed by Tiger Electronics, the Game.com is a 5th-gen horizontal handheld games console that featured a 160 by 200 pixel display. It was Tiger Electronics' first stab at an actual games console, Tiger Electronics being the major player in those simple handheld games as well as the Furby. What was going to distinguish their product from the rest? Well, this could connect to the internet in 1997. Now, let's not get too excited. The only actual internety things you could do was read and send emails, and some very primitive text-based web browsing. This service required you to have a modem and an internet cartridge to work. This was 1997, and the internet was still pretty much in its infancy, so if you think you're going to be gaming with somebody across the world, then forget it. The Game.com also was the first to have touchscreen capabilities, and again, as cool as that sounded, it wasn't really used to its potential, only being needed for a couple of games. It also had this nifty little feature of having 2 game slots, so you could carry an extra game with you on the go. Only 20 games were released for the Game.com that seemed to be aimed towards a mature audience, since 2 of them were Duke Nukem 3D and Resident Evil 2, but as you can see, not very fun to play. The Game.com was very ahead of its time, and it wasn't to its credit, but was still the first handheld console to have internet connectivity, and so, it makes the list. Multiplayer on gaming consoles has existed pretty much as long as consoles have. Being able to compete against your buddy or sibling was a huge part of why consoles became so big. The handheld console obviously was for single player action, given its design. How would one get around this before the internet connected everyone? Released in 1989 and developed by Nintendo, the Game Boy is a vertical 8-bit handheld console, and the first to be released by gaming giants Nintendo. It was designed by Nintendo legend Gunpei Yokoi, who was also responsible for the Game & Watch series, where the D-pad made its debut. Now, the Game Boy had many things going for it: a quality ergonomic design, an extensive games collection, and one thing you could do is connect your Game Boy to somebody else's Game Boy to play multiplayer games. You would do this via a link cable, which you would connect in the side of each Game Boy. This only allowed for 2 players to play, but for 1989, this was insane. Some notable 2-player games for the Game Boy were the Pokemon games, Tetris, and Double Dragon. Now, the Game Boy really did put handheld consoles on the map. You could say that Nintendo hit a home run with this one. It looked good, its battery life was long, and it was affordable. All this paired with the quality games Nintendo put out, such as Tetris, Super Mario Land, and the Legend of Zelda games. The Game Boy was a major success for Nintendo, selling over 100 million units, with a lifespan of 14 years. Several versions of the Game Boy would be released by Nintendo, which is a testament to just how awesome the system was. Battery life was one of the main issues for handheld consoles. In the 80s and 90s, one of your biggest worries whilst gaming was, will your batteries give out mid-game? They were also an extra unwanted expense. Some handhelds had a better battery life than others, of course, but they are always seen as a major handicap. Released in 2003 and developed by Nintendo, the Game Boy Advance SP is a 6th generation handheld games console, which served as an upgrade to the Game Boy Advance, released in 2001. It was colour, featured a backlit screen, and had the clamshell flip design, which it also pioneered. The Advance SP had a rechargeable battery, meaning no longer were you a slave to the disposable battery. Now all you had to do was charge it at night and you were good to go the next day. On a full charge, the battery life could last up to 18 hours, which was ample time for you to game all week. Once again, Nintendo had hit a home run with the SP. It was compact, came in many different colours, and had backwards compatibility with the Game Boy Color and the OG Game Boy. That isn't to say it was perfect, as Nintendo neglected to include a headphone jack with the SP. This was the first handheld Nintendo release with no headphone jack, which was baffling in retrospect. What exactly were they thinking? That people on the bus suddenly wanted to hear you play Mario? They did release their own brand of headphones that you could use, or you could purchase an adapter to make your regular ones fit. So Nintendo. The very idea of using batteries for a handheld now is archaic, thanks to Nintendo and the Advance SP. In the early 2000s, TVs changed from a 4:3 to a 16:9 ratio, better known as widescreen. Home game consoles such as the PlayStation 2 and Xbox followed suit, making their games in widescreen. Widescreen was where it was at in terms of TV displays, and it was only a matter of time before handheld consoles caught onto the trend. Released in 2004 and developed by Sony, the PlayStation Portable, or PSP, is a 7th generation handheld console and the first to be released by Sony. It had a horizontal form factor, featured both a D-pad and analog stick, and could render fully 3D graphics. The PSP was the first handheld to feature a widescreen display, making the gaming more in line with what you get with a home console. The display was 480 by 272 pixels, as we weren't quite on HD quality just yet, but as you can see, what it delivered was just awesome. The PSP really did feel like we had turned a corner with handheld gaming. You could connect to the internet and download games, it had fully 3D graphics, and you could use it as a media center, being able to play music and movies. It didn't pioneer any of these things, but did them so well. The games came in optical disc format too, since it was PlayStation and they don't do game cartridges. Several versions of the PSP would be released over the coming years, such as the PSP 2000 and 3000, that were more powerful, had slimmer designs, and a better battery life. It was discontinued in 2014, having over 2,000 games released for it, being succeeded by the PS Vita in 2011. Today's handhelds are all about emulation. Companies like Miyoo and Anbernic have made quality emulation devices so accessible that handheld consoles have never been so popular. Released in 2001 and developed by Game Park, the GP32 is a 6th gen horizontal handheld games console released in South Korea and some parts of Europe. It featured a 4:3 display of 320 by 240 pixels, an analog stick, and 2 shoulder buttons. Its design was very similar to the Game Boy Advance. The developers made its system open source, enabling amateur software developers to produce their own games for the handheld. These would be available in the public domain for all users to download and enjoy. This also meant that game emulation was possible on the handheld, making the GP32 the first handheld to be able to emulate video games. Given this was 2001, the limits of emulation would have been 16-bit and below, so anything up to Mega Drive, Super Nintendo level would have been achievable. Pretty standard stuff for today's devices, but in 2001, being able to emulate at this level on a mere handheld device would have been mind-blowing. The GP32 had 28 games released for it, such as Little Wizard and Treasure Island, but it's fair to say its focus was homebrew games and emulation. The GP32 was a very ambitious device and very ahead of its time with what it could do. Despite the GP32 not being released worldwide, it has a large international community of users and developers, selling 30,000 units by the end of 2007. Emulation is what handhelds are all about now. Handheld companies aren't making devices with plans to make the best games for them, but instead with the best emulation software, so you can play the classics, and even modern games. There are still new games being developed through smaller indie companies and homebrews to be downloaded, but they're not exclusive to handheld devices. Don't get me wrong, I love my emulation handheld devices, but there's something sad about never again anticipating that next game release for a handheld. Never again will we have the feeling of slapping that game cartridge in the slot. Handheld consoles weren't just an afterthought or compromise, but really were their own thing with their own great games and communities. Have we lost out on something, guys? Or am I just an old man, nostalgic for his younger years? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video on handheld console first, guys. I had a lot of fun researching this one and finding out about some of these handhelds. I'll cover home consoles in one of these videos soon. If you enjoyed this Which Did It First vid, then consider checking out some of these others I've uploaded. Be sure to like, share, comment and subscribe for more content like this. There's still a bunch of genres I'd like to cover in this series, so keep watching. I'm the Stock Retro Gamer, and I'll catch you in the next one.